Let's get started. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's CCA Accelerator webinar on carrying the weight of campus change, the role of equity advocates in higher education. So today's topic is leadership and culture. I'd like to welcome our presenters today, Dr. Eric Felix and Dr. Carlos Galan. Eric Felix is a proud son of Mexican and Guatemalan immigrants. Born and raised in Anaheim, California, he is the product and beneficiary of public education from kindergarten to graduate school. Eric is the first in his family to attend and graduate college. Now he gets to be a faculty member at San Diego State University and do his best to fulfill our state's promise of providing affordable, quality, and transformative education. He holds three principles: partner, parent, professor, and does his best to be present and passionate for each. As an associate professor at SDSU, he leads the CCHALES Research Collective, which focuses on examining the systems, structures, and practices within higher education that perpetuate racial inequity. Using critical policy analysis, Eric explores the ways that policymakers craft higher education reform and how institutional leaders implement them. Particularly, he focuses on understanding how the implementation of lauded student success reforms may benefit, harm, or render invisible racially minoritized groups in the community college context. Ultimately, Eric's work seeks to highlight the possibilities of policy reform and lift up the individual and institutional stories of organizational change that improves racial equity across higher education. Carlos A. Galan, PhD, is an assistant professor in the counseling program of the College of Education at California State University, San Bernardino. As a first-generation college goer and immigrant to the United States, Dr. Galan's personal and professional experiences working in K-12, nonprofit, and university settings inform his research and practice. Under the assertion that people closest to the problem are the people closest to the solutions, Dr. Galan's research focuses on equity and access, emphasizing the lived experiences and expertise of communities of color to drive organizational change rooted in racial equity. Dr. Galan's research explores how educational policies and practices impact their experiences and opportunities of students, faculty, and staff from communities of color. His scholarship seeks to identify and address barriers to educational and professional success while fostering environments that enhance wellness and equity in secondary and post-secondary education for communities of color and marginalized communities. He earned his PhD in Higher Education Administration and Policy from the University of California, Riverside. And Dr. Galan's academic journey also includes a bachelor's degree in History and Public Policy from the University of California, Los Angeles, and a master's degree in School Counseling from the University of Southern California. I'd like to welcome Dr. Felix and Dr. Galan and invite them to begin today's presentation.
Thank you so much for that, Nichole. What a time to be alive. Good morning from San Diego, California, the unceded lands of the Kumeyaay people. Really excited to be able to talk to y'all around leadership and culture, especially a paper that has really changed the ways that Carlos and I do our work here in California and with other neighboring states that we advance equity with. Before we formally get in, we have about 50 minutes. So we are splitting up our time into 5 areas. Quick background about our work, how we've documented the equity efforts here in California, the role of amazing folks like y'all on their call, equity advocates in organizational change, our own approach moving from, scholarly inquiry to scholarly instigation of equity work, and then some considerations and offerings as we close. I think Nichole did a great job of providing, our bios and sketches of who we are. I think for me and Carlos, we share this identity as being Central Americans. We're not talked about as much. Myself, being a Guatemalan heritage, and Carlos being from El Salvador. I think about, for me, this picture that you see in front of you. My grandmother, born in Guatemala, as a woman, denied education because of their gender. I think about myself in front of you here today on this webinar. that was tracked into being an office receptionist, and all of my training was around getting my words per minute up. If you remember those tests from the 80s and 90s, until there was an intervention from a federal TRIO program, Upward Bound Math and Science, that changed my trajectory. And now I'm here in front of you today. And then my son, who is about to turn 7 next week, and think about the possibilities of what education can be, right? As faculty, as administrators, as counselors, as classified staff, all of us are in higher education to try to create more equitable institutions. And so much of my work comes around these three areas: how education has been denied for some, how it's been afforded for others, and ultimately the possibilities of what can be as we continue to build new, just, and equitable institutions. And I'll kick it off to Carlos to just share a little bit more about his image.
Totally, and thank you so much, Eric. And I stand before you as a former English learner. So I came to the United States at age 15 years old. I attended the largest high school in California, Belmont High School, which a Harvard professor was once coined America's leading dropout factory. And I came to the United States into Belmont High School as a student who was doing okay in school, but for whatever reason, I never saw a college counselor, mainly because there were 5,000 students in my high school and only one college counselor. And my educational journey, although I was performing well in school, was shaped by lack of resources, lack of mentors along the way. But thankfully, I was able to come across some people who guided me through the opportunities of education. And in many ways, that journey started with my grandmother as she migrated to the United States during the 1980s as El Salvador was going through a civil war. And it is because of my grandmother that I stand before you as a faculty member. When I look back, she was the one who initiated this journey for me in the 1980s, not only by migrating to the United States, but also by going and enrolling herself into adult school, learning English, and then becoming a US citizen so that her family can be migrating to the United States. And because of my experiences and because of the different ways that my family has been helped along the way, I know the importance of people wanting to do social justice work as they have provided me and my family with different opportunities that thankfully have allowed us to make life in the United States. And because of that, I am very interested not only in people doing social justice and equity work in higher education, but in paying forward some of the work that I have benefited from along the way.
There we go. There we go.
Going it to Eric.
I know we've shared a lot about ourselves. As we contextualize our remarks around our work, working with change agents in community college to advance racial equity, I'm wondering if we can learn a little bit more about Alfred and Andrew, Anika, Carlos, Willie. Y'all are part of this accelerator group. Y'all are at distinct institutions. If you can get your phone, you can do the QR code. When I advance to the next slide, there'll also be a link for you to be able to access these things. But we're just wondering a couple things, and we have a couple questions. So I'll pause again one more time. In our work, even in California, right, there's 116 community colleges. Each of these colleges have very distinct organizational conditions that empower or sometimes restrict equity leaders to be able to advance their work. And so we want to learn a little bit more about y'all before we get into our own research. And the first one, if you're able to get the QR code working, or if you want to join us at slido.com and then use the reference number, is just what brings you joy to this work as a member of the campus community. And it is a broader thing, right? I think when you think about leadership and culture and organizational change, especially since January 20th, the work is so much harder, right? I'm sure you've had multiple conversations, January 27th, 28th. Wow, $10 trillion are trying to be paused or frozen overnight. What does that mean for my institution? What does that mean for my Title IV funds? What does that mean for Upper Bound Math and Science, McNair's? What does that mean for our HSI grants or our other MSI designation resources? So there's been a lot there, but ultimately, like where's the joy in this work? Because that's what really what's gonna sustain us, right? I think about it when I work with college leaders, I ask them how much time they sit in their car between when they park at their structure or their lot and they actually get out of it, right? That's an indicator of like, am I gonna do this again, right? Like I'm advancing these social justice efforts. I'm one of one on my campus, or I'm one of three people that are trying to talk about equity. Like, am I going to subject myself to this type of institutional trauma again? Some of the things that folks are saying, right? The joys of seeing students come into their own, right? The sense of self-determination beyond even just like academics or a major, seeing students thrive post their college lives. That's amazing, right? Both Carlos and myself, and I'm sure everyone here on the call, are a testament to the power of higher education and the ability to have social mobility. Definitely love conversations with employees as well. We had an early meeting today, 7:30 for a Young Men of Color consortia that we have here on campus. Still had about 40 people. I'm like, I don't know. When there's a good vice provost, right? You'll get 40 people for a 7:30 a.m. call to talk about how we create a better institution for young men of color. And so a couple more things here. All right. Then we'll go to the next question. Every state, has a different name for it. How are you advancing DEI work, justice work? Maybe we're calling it student success initiatives or strategic imperatives, right? That's changed. So you might even in the chat share the ways that equity is being kind of, hopefully at the minimum, sustained, if not maybe a chameleon, right? You are still that same animal, but the color and the shape that you present yourself to the outside changes, but the work does not. Um, so as the folks that are here, Carlos, Dustin, Marcos, Jennifer, Mary, what's up? What's your role in advancing diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility? Yo, that's a big one, right? Data to the groups to inform decisions. Data is a catalyst for action, right? When we work with our college leaders, we see the ones that advance organizational change are the ones that can have deep conversations on data, maybe do additional inquiry before rushing to a solution, but ultimately using inquiry and disaggregated data as drivers for the types of strategies and efforts that they move forward. Systematically addressing barriers in policy and practice. I mean, that is a critical aspect, right? Thinking about the ways that it's not about an individual program or practice or even a belief, but that these systemic issues exist. And if we're able to change big policy or big structures, all students will benefit, but especially those that are historically marginalized. And we have a couple more here. Let's see. Some barriers. Shoo. Got all right. Student centered, and then we're almost at the. I like how Slido does, and Slido probably when you think about engagements, there's poll everywhere. There's like other things. I think Slido is the best. So if you're thinking about like an engagement tool for webinars or even for meetings, it's free, and I mean, obviously, I'm not getting any kind of endorsements, but I like the way the layout, the aesthetic, as well as that starts to kind of layer and analyze in real time, kind of putting these types of things together. It actually reminds me that there's a little bit of an overlap with the last question because y'all started to talk about barriers, but you talked about removing barriers for students and what they experience. But as faculty, as counselors, as administrators, what are the barriers you face, right? In our own work and what we'll talk about in the next couple slides, organizational capacity, right? Time, like, yo, I'm leading like three jobs at once. I'm trying to understand all these policies, interpret them and carry them out, but it's like an added responsibility and not a full-time role. Got the interplay of federal policy with state policy. Um, I know Nichole mentioned that you're all over the place, Indiana, Washington, Maryland, and even in California, right? We have some of the most vocal state leaders talking about us advancing the equity work that we've committed to and are codified in law. But for the longest time, it's being questioned, and there's a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, a lot of worry that people will lose their jobs or even get arrested. I think Carlos, you might have been in the conversation that we had with our equity leaders, and one mentioned that they were worried that if they didn't scrub, equity from their scholarships and financial aid website, that they would be charged with a misdemeanor. So those are real barriers, right? They might not be real actions that someone can take, right? I've read all the executive orders. I'm sure many of you have read these directives and recognize that that's not the case, but there's still this fear, right? Like, wow, like this person is going to totally change the way that they operate and behave because there's this fear of potentially being charged with a misdemeanor. But it looks like of all the things that we're seeing here is time, right? The time to do this work, the time to think about this work, the time to build skills to do the work, the time to build relationships so that it's a coalition and a collective for action, and then policies potentially that are antithetical to change efforts, to equity work, and to the ways that you want to engage as equity leaders. And then there's a variety of smaller ones. And Nichole, I can make sure when I share the slide deck that these results are also there as well. So a couple things around implementing equity in the California context. We've had a really important opportunity to be able to advance equity. We have, again, the community college system, 116 campuses. Probably, if you're not from California, you're always tired of hearing, the largest system in the nation. But really, the sheer number, 116 campuses, 2 million students, tens of thousands of employees, right? You think about we talked about policy as the second, probably biggest barrier in time. You have a policy that comes from the capital, right? It goes to 116 campuses. Then from those 116 campuses, it's going to hundreds of classrooms and interacting with faculty and administrators and students in real time. Just like you are from your college, and maybe you've worked at multiple ones, each one has a different identity, different values, different mission, vision, different shared governance, right? Which could be a catalyst for change or sometimes be an inhibitor for change. For us, this policy has been in the book since 1993. But from your experiences and my experience as a coordinator and as a faculty now, it was an unfunded mandate for the first 20 years, and it was finally funded in 2014. And since then, it's been continuously increasing. But when you think about there not being a standardization across these 116 colleges, some that lead equity efforts are a part-time faculty coordinator, some are directors, some are deans, some are VPs. And as you know, in your own organizational arrangement and context, the type of power, the type of status, the type of relationship you have, if you're doing this as a VP, if you're doing this as a part-time person that's coordinating this, the type of way that your change efforts can advance are going to be quite different. The great thing is that it does require a 3-year institutional equity plan that basically has each college document. What are we going to do for these next 3 years to target the racial disparities, the gender disparities, the disparities amongst veterans or amongst student parents, right? Whatever that college decides as kind of being those priority groups, they get to document that and then propose strategies. And then again, as I mentioned, since 2014, the resources attached to this policy have been critical, right? Nearly $500 million annually allocated to support implementation. And so a really great opportunity to understand how equity is being implemented across the state. We've been doing this in different ways. I'm first and foremost a policy scholar that has grown to be someone that looks more about the agency of individuals within organizations. But here's the policy in front of you. This is one of those things where like we have laws codified in California that require us, as you might see here, right, to think about how we disaggregate data, how we look at eliminating opportunity gaps for students from traditionally underrepresented groups that are then named. And so that doesn't change. If we were in compliance with Prop 209, which was the ban on affirmative action, we're still compliant, right? So like the Dear Colleague letter and some of those other things might hover above us, but they shouldn't really stop our work. Beyond the policy, every institution again then articulates a vision and action for equity over 3 years. So we've been able to study like what do colleges actually share in these plans, right? What are their strategies? As we mentioned in kind of those warm-ups, like are the strategies about changing people's beliefs, right, at the practitioner level? Are the strategies about changing policies that are antithetical to equity? Are the strategies about changing organizational culture and structure, right? Which might not happen in 1 year or 2 years or three, but they're continued to do that, and culture and context and conditions will change. So we study that, as well as some of the things that I'm most interested as a scholar, is what is your imagination for organizational change, right? With any policy, with any resources, what's both your imagination and your risk tolerance to be able to kind of push towards more just and equitable institutions. And then the people. With only 50 minutes, we'll be brief, but Carlos and I are part of a research practice partnership with 20 community colleges in the state, anywhere between 150 and 200 educators. And we come together on a bi-monthly basis on Zoom, so pretty similar to this accelerator. And then we have an annual convening. We just had it in January, where we talk about how we, one, celebrate the equity work, because all the time it's like, yo, like, report out your equity progress, move on to the next thing. It's like, yo, let's pause, let's celebrate the success, right? The building of infrastructure. Like, you might not see the change in the metrics and the outcomes, and kind of like in quantitative impact, but man, look at the capacity, look at the infrastructure, look at the culture, that now in a year or two you'll see kind of the impact at the student level metric. And so this is one of the beautiful things in terms of moving from studying policy to studying the plan to being in community with people, and rather than documenting change, doing change with them. Um, and again, as I mentioned, it's just an opportunity for us to shift as scholars to basically struggle in solidarity with folks. And as Carlos will talk about, is understanding, the taxation, the burdens, and really like the hardships that individuals face, especially when they feel isolated or alienated on a campus of hundreds of colleagues and they still feel like they're alone. So Carlos, send it off to you.
Thank you, Eric. And, in our study, we really had two central questions that we set ourselves to investigate. And one of the questions was us trying to really understand what type of emotional and racialized labor is experienced by equity leaders advancing racialized organizational change in community college. The next question was, when implementing racial equity efforts in community college, what forms of resistance and challenge are faced by equity leaders? And in answering these two research questions, really what we learned through our findings, or what we set out to really investigate, is trying to uncover the invisible weight, the invisible resistance, the invisible responsibility that is often asked of student equity leaders as they lead change efforts at their campus. And oftentimes, this invisible labor, this invisible responsibility goes beyond the scope of the responsibilities of different student equity leaders on college campuses. So these two questions really allow us to really be in community, really empathize and understand what is asked of different student equity leaders as they implement race-conscious efforts in their community colleges. And we can go to the findings, Eric. I'm sorry, the theoretical framework, because to answer this research questions, we'll really borrow from critical organizational lens. And in doing that, we deployed three concepts. One of the concept was cultural taxation. And think of cultural taxations as the burden placed on communities of color, particularly on leaders of color, professionals, to address racial equity because of their identity as a person of color. So sometimes when you embark cultural taxation, you are asked to do things related to equity because of your positionality as a person of color. So by default, being a person of color, oftentimes you're placed in a position to do equity work just because you are a person of color. The next lens that we borrow was this idea of emotional labor. And the concept of emotional labor really talks about how people of color, equity leaders, they oftentimes were put in a position where they needed to manage their emotions as they experience toxic relationships, as they experience resistance from different campus community members to embark in this equity effort. So not only were people asked to undertake cultural taxation, but in that process, they undertook emotional labor as they had to manage their emotions, as they tried to break through different modes of resistance that the campus community had when it comes to racial equity efforts. And last but not least, we borrow from this idea, this concept of racialized equity labor. And this idea of racialized equity labor really details how oftentimes you have this upfront, up and coming racial equity efforts wanting to create meaningful change. But what happens is that at the end of the day, once these ideas are institutionalized by the organization, oftentimes this well-intended efforts get diluted and are not what people of color ultimately wanted. And in that process goes back to folks oftentimes get delusional, disappointed because what they were trying to articulate, the efforts that they were trying to pass in the campus community become not what they wanted to be as these different initiatives interact with campus structures. With that said, we go into the findings, and with the findings really was an opportunity for us to understand what are the experiences of people leading equity work through the lens of cultural taxation, emotional labor, and racialized equity labor. So we have the paper, if you read it, is divided into two themes, two themes. But the first finding is the racialized equity labor that equity leaders undertake. And this finding really explores the invisible racialized emotional labor that student equity leaders endures. And it's broken down into three main burdens. First of all is this idea of taxation. And as I explained before, this comes from the concept of cultural taxation, right? This idea that by your identity of being an equity leader as a person of color, you are put in a position of leading equity efforts. So in this first quote, you have a person who is expressing that you get tired, but you have to be willing to take the amount of taxation and racial battle fatigue just to see your efforts go through. I think it got blurry a little bit. And in this process, you can see that folks when they undertake taxation, right, they're not only put in a position where they have to do the extra work because of their positionality as a person of color, as a student equity leader, but they do have to endure racial battle fatigue, and it's on them to really manage those emotions and take care of themselves as they endure those extra responsibilities. Folks in our study, they also talked about the isolations. Oftentimes, this equity work is carried out in silos, right? They want to they want to do this work in community, but by default and oftentimes by their positionality on campus, they were left to do this work alone. Oftentimes because there was no shared commitment from different campus community members to do this work. So equity leaders oftentimes were put in a position where they needed to advance equity work on their own with little or not commitment from different campus community members, as it is exemplified on this quote that we have here. And, you know, it was not uncommon in our study for equity leaders to operate without teams. It was also, or minimal support. Oftentimes this work was done alone. A lot of times they were put in a position where equity leaders, they were seen as the sole voice of equity work on campus without no symbolic commitments from senior leadership. And that created a lot of toll on our participant, because oftentimes more and more they were put in a position where they were the only ones that needed to talk about equity work and lead equity work. And that created a lot of sense of isolation, and by default that translated into a third theme, which is this idea of burnout. Because as our participants were engaged in equity work on campus and undertaking different initiatives to lead change efforts, many of them express not only that burnout, but this signs of racial battle fatigue, just feeling exhausted of them having to speak up over and over and over again about equity issues without little or no campus commitment and support. And you can see it in this quote. And in doing that, or participants really spend a lot of time trying to convince different people that equity work and race issues matter on campus. Um, and as they were doing that, they found repetitive resistance from different campus stakeholders. And that process created a lot of burnout, a lot of resistance that they needed to overcome. And for them, for participants in the study, it really became a tiresome process of having to resist, having to overcome, and really having to do all of this with little or no support. And all of that speaks to the taxation, to the isolation, but ultimately leading to the burnout that that our student equity leaders face, leading change efforts in their community colleges. And this is exemplified by the 3 quotes that we have in this table. You can really see that that as folks were trying to do this work, all of that was present, which goes into the second theme that we have, which is the faculty resistance, right? And in these findings, a lot of times faculty felt like they were blamed for how faculty felt that they were to blame for how slow equity works were happening at the college campus. But at the end of the day, you start to see that there was faculty resistance, right? A lot of times, equity leaders felt that faculty members created additional barriers for them to move equity work. So oftentimes as our student equity leaders were engaging with faculty, faculty questioned their data, faculty members oftentimes referred to instances in which students were doing just fine and try to just have one example as a way to uncredit what the big data set was sharing about student performances, students' needs on college campuses. And that created a lot of barriers for student equity leaders, because not only were they doing this work in isolation, but also getting a lot of pushbacks and resistance from faculty members. And that resistance also was in shared governance as well. Oftentimes, or student equity leaders were confronted with academic senates and structures that delayed, diluted, or blocked their racial equity works, their racial equity efforts. Oftentimes, faculty use governance process to challenge the language or change the legitimacy of what these equity leaders were trying to change on college campuses. And unfortunately, as our equity leaders were invested in creating change efforts, some faculty members and even in the academic senate, these change efforts were mock equity works equity goals were made fun of, and oftentimes were pointed as unrealistic, or this argument that the equity work that were discriminatory against other communities started to come up. So kind of similar to what we see in this current political climate, where we see equity efforts as having unintended consequences on student groups, as opposed to seeing equity efforts as a way to help students who need the most support. And we can go to next slide, Eric, because what we really see, and the big takeaway from these findings, is equity work was oftentimes placed on the few individuals who carry the title of student equity leaders. So equity work in our paper was placed only on those individuals invested in doing equity work. And what really taught us is that when equity work is placed on the few individual, on the one individual on college campuses with that title, equity works cannot be done in isolations. When done in isolation, it will lead to a lot of individual challenges such as burnout and isolated actions. But to do equity work, we really need to move away from that individual work to that collective effort that is backed up by different campus community members. And the goal here is to move from that individual effort to more of a collective campus support. And to do that work, we really need the whole campus community to come to the aid of these student equity leaders because they are doing the work alone. And we need commitments from the from the community colleges, from the institutions to ensure that this work is not longer done alone. And Eric, I think this is where I pass it on to you because we do need that responsibility to be moved from that individual to the collective, and we have some ideas for that.
Let's get it. Yeah, I was looking at Andrew's question as it relates to how this work is being done in California. I have I'll link a variety of tools in a little bit, but I think this is where, you know, as change leaders at your institutions and respective regions and states is really kind of arming yourself with the policy language and the laws and the governing guidelines that empower you to carry out student success or equity if it's palatable in your own context. So, you know, Prop 209, which Andrew refers to, is Section 31 of the California Constitution, and that was codified in 1996. It's one of those interesting things around really its interpretation, right? So the state shall not discriminate against or grant preferential treatment to any individual or group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in public employment, education, or contracting. And the interpretations over the last 30 years is, again, if in public spaces, talking about education, if you have campus-based research and you disaggregate data based on race, ethnicity, and gender, and you find that these public institutions are producing inequitable results, and they're already like admitted, right? So they're already current students, you can be race conscious and gender conscious in your work. So the notion again is that preferential treatment is not in the admissions of a student or in the granting of a scholarship or maybe undergraduate research opportunity or like types of housing. But if a student is already enrolled in that campus and you're doing campus-based research that's disaggregated by whatever characteristics or identities you're looking at, if you find them to have experiencing what the state labels as disproportionate impact, you can address, right? It's almost like, wow, we need to have like a long conversation with legal counsel around what's our institution's interpretations of this policy, what's our state's interpretation of this policy, how does it push against or comply with the federal government's interpretation of policy, right? And as Andrew mentions, both the Supreme Court and then the extrapolation of students for further admission as it relates to interpreting like civil rights discrimination laws from the 1960s now being flipped, where like doing equity work is actually discriminatory, right? And so we have these layers, right? How do I interpret it as an individual, as an institution, as a state, and as a federal context? But ultimately in California, if a student is enrolled and you again do campus-based data disaggregation, you can address them in specific ways, right? And it can be tailored. And so that's one of the benefits. But it takes a lot of precedent. It takes a lot of basically like 100-page memo around like what does Prop 209 mean in this current context. And as I mentioned, I created a resource for community colleges in the state to recognize that like we even have as a law, right, that all public institutions have to advance equity and have to create equal educational environments so that all students can reach their potential, right? We have laws that protect and empower us to support undocumented students. So just reminding us like these are all the things that we've passed over the last 60 years, at least in this state, that not just like prompt you, but require you to advance equity in your own individual role. But getting back to this paper, um, you know, once we recognize like the weight that individuals carry, we move from again, it's similar to like being asset based with students, right? A lot of times with like the deficit notions of like what is it about the students and how come they're not being successful in the class. Some of the research is always like, what is it about these leaders and their competency or their skill sets and how come they're not advancing organizational change or implementing these things? And we also took an asset based approach and is like, what is it about the organization, right? What is it about the organization's commitments? What is it about the organization's responsiveness to your needs, right? And we came up with kind of like 4 different areas. One was like, first and foremost, there needs to be this symbolic commitment from the institution, the president, the governing board, the executive cabinet, even academic senate, maybe through resolutions or proclamations or statements, whatever the mode is of communication. But there needs to be like an active direction set by senior leaders around how people are going to move forward, right? A desired goal, a destination. A lot of times, and you might experience this and it resonates with you, you're like, I want to advance this work, but I need the green light from this person. Or, we have an interim president. I'm not sure that's the direction they want to set. So I'm going to focus, my change efforts in a more localized area. You have this kind of like, are my senior leaders absent? Are they aware of the work, or are they active in carrying out the work, right? You kind of see this in different ways. A paper that Carlos and I are coming out with is like, are they absent from the work? Are they aware of the work but not really involved, or are they active in like, moving in this work with you? The second part is that, I mean, achieving equity or even closing equity gaps, it's a high resource endeavor. Like, there is no way that we are going to dismantle these structures of inequity and reach, whether it's like a state level college completion goal, right? Like 40 by 2030, or I think we've moved on to like 40 by 2050, right? Remember we had these 2020 goals and then the pandemic happened, but every state was like, we're going to get to 60% credential by 2020. Then it's 2030, now it's 2040, but the number is still the same. And I think the big thing is, from your state legislatures, from your systems, like, yo, like, equity is a high resource, long-term endeavor, right? Y'all know that as leaders. I know that as a faculty member, as a researcher, right? So the second institutional commitment is material. You need dedicated resources and support, whether that's personnel, whether that's funding, whether that's capacity building, right? Course release, reassign time. Because as Carlos mentioned, when you don't have the symbolic or the material commitments, it starts to feel isolating. It starts to feel alone. You really feel that taxation. The other aspect, and it's a beautiful thing that you're part of Complete College America and this accelerator, is that you need the technical skills, right? Um, when colleagues are advancing equity efforts and like, oh, we want to create an engagement center for men of color, like that's a great idea, but do we have the skills to build that engagement center, to create the logic framework, to create the curriculum, to hire the folks that then are going to be as responsive and as relevant to men of color in this engagement center, right? Or we're building a summer bridge program for women of color because we recognize that transfer takes a lot longer for Black and Latinx women based on the barriers they face. Okay, do we have the technical skills for that? And if we don't, can we build up our own competencies, right? That takes time, that takes money as well. Or do we bring someone in? Every campus has different kind of behaviors and decisions around bringing consultants or bringing technical assistants. But really, like, we need symbolic commitment, we need material commitment, we need a technical commitment, and then we need the relational one, which I think is the most important one. Because as we start to think about equity, right, not as an individual effort, but as a systemic one, then we start to recognize that we need collective action, that we need equity or student success, depending on your state, to be a social movement, right? Where you create coalitions and shared space for conversations, where you have that time to think, right? Time was the biggest barrier. Like if I went back to that slide, like time was like, the biggest thing. It's the only thing we can never get back as well. And so for us in our work, it's working with these equity leaders and now saying like, how do we talk to system level leaders, your board of governors, and say we need symbolic, material, technical, and relational commitments because that's the way forward in thinking about how we move equity work. And it's been really fruitful to work with equity leaders. Sometimes we have like mock interviews. I'm like, pretend I'm your president and you're talking about you lost, 3 staff members and you can't do this equity work without additional resources, right? Like, how does that work? Like, sometimes you're like, man, what I really want to say to the president would get me fired, but let me practice this advocacy around the ways that the organization is not meeting the expectations, or even right the call for the job that I took. Right, when I took this job, I thought I was going to be set up for success, but a lot of times, many people feel like they're set up for failure, and so these 3 areas really make a difference, right? And if you think about it as an analogy, as building something, a lot of times in our work, we recognize that senior leaders, presidents, trustees, they're kind of like the architects setting up the vision for equity. And a lot of time, we have mid-level leaders, grassroots leaders that are the ones that are supposed to carry it out. But without these commitments, you're like, okay, build me this equitable structure. You're like, all right, do we have like land to build on, right? Do we have permits for this construction? Do we have all the resources that we need, right? Cement, rebar, bricks, all these stuff, right? Do we have the technical skill to build things? Like my dad's been in construction for 30, 40 years, and I don't even know how to hang up drywall, right? Like I had this leak in my house and he came and like did all these things. Like, man, that is an amazing skill. Like you got your GED and you did all these amazing things. And I'm like, man, like I don't have that technical skill, right? I want to build something, but I bring in people to be able to support me. And then the relational one is like, yo, if we're not doing this together, or at least you're not against me or actively resisting me, we're not going to move forward. But that's the biggest thing, right? It's just like, how do we come together? Because I think, as Carlos mentioned in the paper, there was some, and this is a weird thing to say, but like there was antagonism, and people were, either fighting for the same resources, or it was a blame game. Like, there's inequity in the classroom, and then faculty were like, well, classroom is our purview, instruction is our purview, like how dare you say that inequity is here. And so it's not really about like the blame game, but it's like, yo, like students are experiencing inequity on campus, whether it's like in counseling spaces, in the residence halls if you have that, or in the classroom. But like, how do we come together and change all of these aspects? And so the relational one is probably the most important one for leaders to be able to move forward. And Carlos will get us to a Padlet activity that will get you to just kind of share out some of your experiences in leading this work.
Absolutely. And I am actually looking at time. So what I am going to do right now is to put the link to the Padlet. And I think about this Padlet activity as an exit ticket. And if you click on that link, you are going to be welcomed by 4 different questions. So we want you to think about what about your equity work on campus brings you pride or keeps you connected to your why? What challenges come up in your equity work on campus? How do you do equity work in community or build coalitions across campus? And last but not least, we want you to reflect on the 4 organizational commitments that we share. So we want you to think about which of the 4 organizational commitments can better support your equity work. So I think about this Padlet activity as an exit ticket for our time together, but also recognizing that we might have some questions. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind just reacting to that Padlet, kind of using it as your exit ticket from this space. And in between, if we can have a Q&A session, because I'm sure that you probably have some thoughts or ideas that you would like to share.
Yeah, one more thing, Carlos. I added another slide, so surprise. So we'll go to this one. I will put this in the link, but a lot of the resources, anything that we do, at least in the California context, is scaled up for our entire system. So the image here is basically anything we've done as scholars or as research practice partners. We make it in publicly accessible ways. So you have all these aspects here. What we didn't get to, and is at the genesis of what we did with our work, is this kind of second area around organizational mapping, readiness for change, and implementation capacity. But if you click on any of these 3 areas, we actually have like a standalone mapping activity that kind of shares where you are around these organizational conditions and what's the pathway moving forward. And then once you start implementing your equity efforts, we also have something around how you navigate the implementation icebergs, which is the lack of symbolic, material, technical, and relational commitments. So those are some of the aspects there. As you think about, our remarks and our work, if you've read the article or not, or if you explore any of the tools and resources we have, but really just thinking about, what our role in advancing educational equity looks like, right? and how we can build a collective, whether it's this accelerator or a team on your campus, to imagine a deeper vision for racialized change, right? That's the first thing. When you talked about the barriers in our engagement part at the beginning, we're like, how do we contend with the enduring structures of inequity and the onslaught that's going to produce even more inequity, right? Potentially loss of funds for federal work study students, financial aid, uncertainty around WIC and SNAP and things that a lot of our students, right now that basic needs is at the forefront. Like these are things that allow for students to just learn and thrive on campus because their basic needs are met, right? But how do we contend with the enduring structures and the pernicious and perpetuating inequities that are coming from our current administration? And then the last thing is like, if we are to move towards more just and equitable community colleges and institutions more broadly, like we have to do something differently, right? We have to dream and do and demand differently to achieve these types of different results. So hopefully our conversations around not just carrying the weight, but ultimately relinquishing the weight by demanding and using your agency for your organizations to be responsive vis-a-vis these four organizational commitments, give you additional tools to advance your own work in the context and in the conditions that you experience. So any questions that you might have before we close out?
Questions?
I don't see questions, but some gratitude. But the gratitude goes both ways. Thank you for being in community with us today.
I'd like to, on behalf of CCA, thank Dr. Galan and Dr. Felix for their presentation. I know these are very salient and challenging issues for many of us as we think through how to meet both legal and moral requirements to our students. Before we close out, I'd like to drop in the chat a few links to upcoming CCA events. We have our Policy Summit and Day on the Hill coming up in June. Our next From Data to Decisions Data Days event will be in July in Denver, Colorado. And of course, the CCA annual convening, where I hope to see all of you and hear from many of you giving presentations. Keep an eye on our social media for the call for proposals and registration link for that. But again, we thank our guests and thank you for attending today's Accelerator webinar. We'll be sending out all of the links from the chat and the file that Dr. Felix shared in the follow-up email.